Okay, let me do a little screen share and we'll get started. All right. Still looks like we have a few more people coming in, so we'll give them one more minute and we'll get going. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening. My name is Terry Lucas. I'm the director of the Shelter Island Public Library. We're pleased to be collaborating with the Shelter Island Health and Wellness Alliance on this very special program. This program is a Zoom webinar, so you will not see your fellow attendees. If you have technical difficulties, put your questions or issues in the chat, and I'll do my best to help you. At the end, we're going to have some time for questions, and there's a Q&A section. So type your questions in the Q&A, and we'll do our very best to get to all the questions that we receive. Let's see what else. We will also be recording this, as I said previously, and it will be available on our YouTube channel a little bit later. That's really all from me. I'm happy to introduce you to Lucille Burgers from the Shelter Island Health and Wellness Alliance, and she'll tell you a little bit more, and she'll tell you about our moderator tonight.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Lucille Burgers. I'm the Shelter Island Town Social Worker. And as Terry mentioned, I'm representing the Shelter Island Health and Wellness Alliance, who with the Shelter Island Library is excited to present the fourth program in the Necessary Bridges series that we've been having. The Shinnecock Nation was part of Long Island long before the beachfront properties and the golf club that bears its name in Southampton. The program titled We Are Still Here is going to be part history lesson, part celebration, and part call to action. So we're very excited to welcome some young and veteran leaders of the nation. And I'd like to introduce our moderator, who's a native Shelter Islander, Atirame Lawrence. And Atirame is a freelance actress, model, and activist based on the East End of Long Island. She grew up on Shelter Island and has received her Bachelor of Fine Arts from Fredonia State University, along with a minor in creative writing. So we are very, very grateful to Atirame for her planning, organizing, and arranging this webinar. She's done some great work in getting our panelists together. And I'm going to let Atirame introduce our wonderful panelists for this evening. And I look forward to hearing what everyone has to say. So thanks again for coming.
Thank you, Lucille. I'm happy to be here. Happy to have everyone here. For some household notes, I just want to discuss the importance of us being here and the importance of allies and amplifying Indigenous voices to decolonize their stories for what we may hear to something that is of their voice and accurate. We want to uplift their humanity. I just researching this project and looking at everybody saying that people barely know that the Shinnecocks exist, and being that they are here and right there, I think it's very much important for us to, you know, show them to the world. And Shelter Island may be a small community, but we do have reach and we do have neighbors that could use us, and if not, build bridges and connections to where we can be there for our Native neighbors. There is a very strong Indigenous commitment to the healing of our relationships, but not so much for, you know, ourselves, more so for the planet, and to focus on preserving their communities and their heritage and their history, and a lot of focus on their human rights. Just a general note of how to be a genuine ally. It involves a lot of self-reflection and education and listening. I've had to learn that myself through just working on this webinar, but through everything that I've done. I'm usually on the opposite side of the spectrum, focusing on African American studies, but um, having the opportunity to do this is very important. And it means knowing that we often come from a space of power and privilege, even myself. And that privilege is gained through unjust systems of marginalized people that we seek to ally with. It is not enough just to show up, and it is not enough just to speak out against these unjust systems. We have to do what is in our power to dismantle these systems and differentiate ourselves from the opponents of these groups. We have to change our behaviors and be mindful that we are contributing to keep that system going. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our panelists. You can click the next slide, Terry. So we have Miss Denise Silva-Dennis. I would love to hear your traditional name, and please tell us more about yourself.
All right. Hello, everyone, and it's such a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you, Shelter Island Public Library and the Shelter Island Health and Wellness Alliance also. What an awesome collaboration. And thank you, ladies, also. I'm going to start out by saying Akwe, Nitapa, Denise, Kwa, Widamo, Natisuis, Silva-dennis, Nichapayuunk, Shinnikak Kwa, Hasanasko, Nipmunk, Nichashayuunk, Shinnikak, Nitap. So I finished saying hello, and my name is Denise, and my native name is Widamo. Widamo means sweetheart. My grandmother on my father's side named me that. From Massachusetts, the Massachusetts area. And then I said Shinnikak Nitap, and that means that I live on Shinnikak.
Thank you very much. So you have a very unique situation, very similar to Shanae. You are part of two tribes. Can you describe growing up in two tribes and what that was like for you?
Well, it was first of all, I'm the youngest in the family. So there was 3 boys and 3 girls. And my mom's from Shinnikak through her dad. And then my dad has Sanamisco in Massachusetts from his mom. So all 6 of us were kind of immersed it was almost like a little pot. And we learned about, both tribes. But we lived on Shinnikak. And that's where I grew up. And then what we would do in the summertime is we would go to Massachusetts, in Grafton, Massachusetts. That's where the Hassanamisco Nation is. And it's, I believe it's like the 3rd or 4th tiniest nation in the United States. So it's still there miraculously. And would go and visit, and I would just be exposed to, similar, because we're all Algonquin Native Americans, which is we're all, in the eastern northeast section of the United States. Things would be similar, but some of the different styles, influenced me. And then as I developed my own talents, I kind of came up with a whole another style of doing things. But we were taught, history, culture, who our people are going back generations, what land was special, what land was sacred in both areas.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you for that. We're going to get back to you, obviously, to talk about your art and activism, as well as your son. And we'd like to next introduce, I believe Renee is next on the list. Am I right? You can click the next slide. Shanae, this woman honestly she has an introduction that I could, read and read and read. She has so many titles and accomplishments and accolades. Honestly, just an inspiration to me. Recently being involved in activism, although I feel like my life is activism, I'm sure she feels the same way. Shanae is very inspiring and doing amazing things, not just in her community on the reservation, but, internationally and nationwide. I would love for her to tell us more about herself and we'd love to hear your traditional name as well. Shanae?
Tabutne, Tabutne. Nadasui se kampanayu mashuna tu uskwa, what you shinnecock, what you kamanaki, what you siwanhaki. My given name is I Lead Canoe. I'm Butterfly Woman. Um, I am the daughter of Esther Lee and the daughter of Reginald Bullock. That's where the Bullock comes from. And I didn't want to tear up, but I'm just the introduction was just really empowering. You know, I'm a young woman of color, right? And I think it's so important that we recognize one another. So for you to see me in my light, it's just really just me just being a reflection of your light. And you know, since I was a little girl, I've always been this color, right? This brown, this richly melanated person. And as I've gotten older, there's been a lot more conversation about it. You know what I mean? And I really just kind of just step out, regardless what people think or say. And I just hope that women like you see me.
I see
You
you.
could do what you do. So that was just really empowering to hear you give that introduction, and I thank you. Um, so I guess just a little bit of just the introduction of just who I am. You know, my mother was born and raised here on Shinnecock, so I was raised by a Native woman. So my Black woman story is my own. You know, I wasn't raised by a Black woman. I had to figure that experience out for myself. I was raised with both parents. My dad, who is African American, born in Philly, they met in New York City and they took off around the world. So I was a military brat, but my mother was always a traditional Native woman. So no matter where we lived, I've lived in Saudi Arabia, Kamish Mache. I've been in Dubai before it was cool.
Wow.
I've been to Mecca. I've lived in Tennessee. I've pretty much lived in every big city up and down the East Coast, but at the same time, the most consistent place in my life was Shinnecock. For one, because it's who I am, and that's who my mother is. But it also is where all the love has been my entire life. So all the teaching that I've had, you know, no matter where we live. So with activism on both sides, the elders and stuff in my family, um, you know, have always stood out, I guess you could say, on the front lines. And at the time, it really wasn't always looked at as the front lines. They were just really just fulfilling their inherent obligation to our people. Just like Denise said, you know, growing up, my mother was always taught what was sacred, what needed to be protected, all those different kinds of things. So as her daughter, I was taught the same thing, whether I was here or not. So when I come home and I see my aunties or my uncles or my cousins fighting those very same places that I was always taught about, it's my inherent obligation too. Now, on my father's side, my grandmother was actually his mother. Um, she's always been an inspiration because she was also a part of that Greensboro sit-in, the Freedom Riders. So I had both sides, you know, as being African American
Wow.
and Native American. So that's just really, I guess, where the inspiration of the activism comes from, because it's an inherited obligation.
From a family of fighters. That's amazing. I just want to point out the photos on the bottom as well. Um, that is Shanae at the Indigenous Peoples March in Washington, D.C., as well as at the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota, which is still an ongoing issue, if I'm not mistaken. And it goes to show that the activism doesn't end at home. It ends when you reach out to other communities that need you. And I can only imagine you have a powerful voice. I would love to see you in action at, you know, a march or a rally. And I'm just once again in awe to have you here and very happy. She is a business owner as well, and we will get into that a little bit later when we start talking about the work that she does. Next, we'd like to introduce Mr. Shane Weeks. Shane, you could kick the next slide as well.
Kwena Tapel, Bijaki Nabat, Nadasuis, Bijaki and Dodam, Asana Kognawachi, Medeu and Matawak Nina. Hello, my friends and family. My name is Standing Buffalo. I'm of the Buffalo Clan, and I'm a Medewin Matawak man from Shinnecock. My given name is Shane Weeks, but Bijaki Niboit is who I am. And I'd just like to thank the Shelter Island Library for having us today. I guess just going into a little bit of my work, I currently sit on a few boards and committees. One being I am co-chair of the Shinnecock Nation Graves Protection Warrior Society. I sit on the Southampton Town Joint Shinnecock Nation Cultural Stewardship Committee, as well as the Southampton Town Arts and Culture Committee. Most of my work revolves around expressing who we are as Shinnecock people. It revolves around being able to share our history, our culture, and learning. That's the key for me, I think, is being able to learn as much as I can about who we are as Indigenous people of this part of the world and bringing that back to my community and bridging those gaps internationally as well as locally to non-Indigenous communities.
Thank you, Shane. We appreciate you being here, and look forward to learning more about you and what you do. We can go to the next slide. So we do have an honorable mention, Mr. Jeremy Dennis. He was the one that actually gave me all of these fantastic panelists. Unfortunately, he is beginning a Gather series, which we'll talk about later on during the presentation. A series of events centering Indigenous and Black creatives, activists, artists, and those events will broadcast as well towards the end. But Jeremy is a fine art photographer, as well as an activist in his own way, and he explores so many beautiful things in his artwork, as you can see to the photo to the left. He couldn't be here, but we just wanted to honor him. And if Denise would like to speak on Jeremy a little bit, I would love to hear, what you have to say, considering we can't have him here.
Okay, I think I know a few things about him.
By the way, this is his mother. I don't know if I mentioned that.
Yes, that's my son. I have 2 children, and he's the youngest of the 2. Before I talk about Jeremy, I just wanted to talk about like relationships on Shinnecock. And Jeremy and Shane actually grew up together, hanging out together since like 3rd grade. We were all in the same school. I was teaching there, and as far as Shanae goes, Shanae was traveling with her family, but I grew up with her mom. So on Shinnecock, we are all related, whether we're cousins or because of the close relationship with Jeremy and Shane. And then there's another one. It's like my 3 sons, Mike. We watch out for each other, and he's like they're both considered my other sons. Like, oh, Shane's my son. I'm like the second mother. That's what we say, right, Shane? So I just wanted to say that to give a little bit of a background, how really close, the ties are with each other, recognizing each other, even if someone is brought up, off reservation, you don't see them for many, many years, you still know, their parents, maybe their grandparents, and those are just really important relationships that we have. And I've heard, on Shelter Island, that's very much the case too with relationships. Families know each other from way back when. So there's so many similarities, and I just want to make that a little point. But, as far as Jeremy goes, he was always very young. He showed his artistic talent. And there was other things he didn't always like to do, as far as school came along. And I am a teacher, I'm trying to push him along. But it's so interesting to me that, if I worried about, it's, reading and writing and this and that and putting pressure on kids. And I just remember other teachers would say, he'll come when he's ready. He will come about. As long as you support him and support things that he loves, then he will get to the place that you want. So he blows me away how he's like writing and online and, and different things that he does. Both he and Kelly, just the work that they do. And for anybody out there who are struggling, with their kids or supporting them, especially since we've gone through COVID, having to teach them at home and help with that. I just want to give you all encouragement out there, or there's a lot of grandparents on here. So, because that's what my mother used to tell me too. She said, leave him alone. He will blossom when he's ready. So what can I say? They both blossom. Shane, my other son, blossomed. So
Yeah,
today's blossoming also. So it's a flower in a beautiful garden.
most definitely. We're grateful to have had his guidance in the beginning process of this presentation. So we just wanted to give him a shout out, and you'll see some of his art featured throughout the presentation as well. We can go on to the next slide. So I just wanted to give you a little information on the Shinnecock Indian Nation, but I would also like to have Shane Weeks maybe speak more about it, or all of our panelists to kind of give your input on the Shinnecock Indian Nation, what it means to you, its grounding in history on Long Island, being here for 13,000 years, and being here far longer than anyone else has. What this island means to you, what this location specifically means to you. We'd love to hear just some history about your nation and how you are today as well.
Sure, thank you. So where do I start? Um, so as you mentioned, Shinnecock we've been on this island for about 13,000 years, and that's just because that's when Long Island was created during the last ice age. But our creation story actually comes from before the creation. It starts before the creation of the universe. And it talks about the creation of the universe, the earth, all the way up until, the first red being was lowered to this realm by the creator. And I've only heard that creation story like 3 times. And I consider it the short version or it's considered the short version, I should say, because it's about 8 hours long, 2 days, and it takes much longer to tell the creation story in its entirety, all before the first red being places, or it goes right up to that first footstep. And so that's really where our story begins as Indigenous people of this part of the world at that time. And our stories are always growing. Our creation stories for everything are always growing. And there's a creation story about why we call North America Turtle Island. There's a creation story for our names, our government systems, who we are today. All of those things have a creation story. And so Shinnecock, we are part of a larger group on Long Island that encompassed all of what I call the myth of the 13 tribes of Long Island. And we were originally known, or the first maps of Long Island, they noted us all as one people. And it said the ancient settlements of the Matawak Indians or people or something like that. And that's important because traditionally we didn't see ourselves as separate people. If we spoke all the same language, as most of the now tribes and nations in the northeast part of the United States and Canada, all of us, we were all one people. The only distinguished differences we had in terms of separation of people was our clan systems, our families. And that was really the only way to distinguish that. Everything else was about where you come from or what your duty is in society. And so Matawak, in my introduction, you probably heard me say that. I am a Matawak, Medewin Matawak man. And Medewin is one of our traditional ways of life here that stems from the northeastern coastline, from I don't know, New Jersey, Maryland, all the way up into Canada along that coastline. And it means way of the heart. Matawak is Mita Aki, place of the heart. And so that is who we were collectively as a people. It wasn't until colonial settlement came to Long Island and came to the Northeast here that they started putting lines in between our communities. And the reason for that was that if you could separate the people, you could, I don't want to say conquer, but that's the term that comes to mind, divide and conquer, right? You would be able to purchase lands from individual communities better than you could from a larger community and speaking to one person. So as the colonists first came to Long Island here, there was only one person that they would talk to at a time. And that person was a representative of all of Long Island. And the most famous or the most noted is Wyandanch, who was said to be the Montaukett chief at the time. And his brothers and relatives and aunts and uncles were chiefs and Sunksquas, woman leaders of all of the other different communities on Long Island, going all the way up into New England, the rest of New England, I should say. And you could kind of look at Montauk, Shinnecock, Manhasset, Korchog, Unkachug. Those are like different towns of a state rather than like Canada, Mexico, Guatemala. You know, they weren't really different nations, different countries. We all worked together as one people, as one nation. And it was just that our leaders, our sachems and Sunksquas, were not kings, you know, as it's known in European history. They were responsible for the care of the lands and the people within a certain territory. It wasn't like their word was law, as it is in kingdoms, right? In our government, traditional government societies, it was our clan system. Our clan system was our government, and there were 7 original clans, and each of those original clans had a duty in society. The Cranes and the Loons were the chiefs, the between internal and external leadership. The Fish were the intellectuals that sat between those two. The Little Paws, like the raccoons or the red foxes, all those things with little paws. The Martins, the Fishers, they were the warriors, the scouts. The Hoof clans were the peacekeepers. The Birds were the communicators. The Bears were the people that protected the outskirts and the medicine people. And each of those clans, the water clans, you know, that they all had a part to play in our society traditionally. And it wasn't until um, forced assimilation of our people that kind of was taken away from us as a people. And we're what's considered a first contact tribe, a first contact community, because we were here when some of the first settlers came to Long Island. Um, in fact, Southampton was the first place on Long Island that the English set foot on. And so we have a much longer history of uh, conflict with the settlers than, let's say, west of the Mississippi, you know, where they only have a couple hundred years of conflict, contact. And so, as I was saying, you know, it started off as there was this one chief who could speak for everybody collectively. And it kind of broke down to now the settlers wanted to speak to different people and were able to purchase lands illegally without the consensus of all of the people, which in our way is not right. You know, that's not a legal way to do land transactions or any kind of transactions. Um, and I should note that purchasing land wasn't even something that we had a concept of. You could not own land. We were a part of the land. We were of the land, and therefore you could not own it. You know, and so as that was broken down, so was our way of life, I should say. You know, forced assimilation into Christianity and to the settlers' world started very early for us in the early 1700s through what was called the Great Awakening. In the UK, it was called the Great Revival. But that's when we were forced into churches, forced to wear English clothing. Our names, our traditional names that we all three of us spoke today, that was taken from our people back then. And they were no longer allowed to talk like that. They were no longer allowed to speak on our ceremonies, our history, our culture. And um, through that time, that's when the written records of our people um, started to become very distorted and only told by the settlers in a certain way. And so through that time, um, our teachings went underground. They went underground in the churches, and they had to be told in secret. And they survived for quite some time. Our people are traditionally matriarchal and matrilineal, meaning women, specifically the Grandmothers Council, was the highest tier in our government system, even above all the clans. Like all the clans collectively um, made up that matriarch uh, society of grandmothers. And we're matrilineal because if, let's say, if I was Shinnecock and I moved to Narragansett, let's say, and I had a child and married a Narragansett, my children would be Narragansett, right? So that's the matrilineal side of that. And so the women always spoke up against this colonial way of life and the taking of our lands. It started with the first land claim in 1662 by Wyandanche's daughter, Quashawam. And in 1662, she tried to sue the English and the Dutch for lands that they took illegally. And it took almost 30 years for that to be resolved. And obviously, it didn't go in our favor. But for the next 100 years, the women tried to speak up. And in Southampton, particularly in the late 1780s, 1770s, there was a lot of resources being taken by the settlers from our lands. And the women asked the town to start um, fining the people, the settlers, taking those things from our land. And finally, in the late 1790s, they decided to do that, but it only lasted a few years, and the Southampton town imposed their government system onto Shinnecock, and what that meant was taking away all rights of women from Shinnecock in the early 1790s, and they imposed a three trustee system that we now have, or a trustee system which was originally three, that we had all the way up until 2012. And women could not vote on Shinnecock or have any kind of say in governmental matters for almost 200 years, up until the 1990s. And that stems from that forced imposition of that government system, because they realized the power of our women here. And so that just brings us into today a little bit. Maybe somebody can talk a little more on that.
Thank you. Yes, if any of the other panelists would like to comment on the Shinnecock Nation, I would love to hear from you. Even if you want to start going into the needs today and current events, we'd be happy to hear from you.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Shane. That was really good synopsis of, that whole history and what happened, and silencing women, because Quashawam had fought so much to be represented, because that was the way, that the women, ran the tribe. I mean, the nation, the territory. Even like with the planting of food, it was the women who said, this is where we're going to have summer camp, and this is where we're going to have our corn, beans, and squash planted. And then they would tell the men, okay, this is where the winter camp is going to go, because our men, they were out on the ocean going after the right whale or hunting. Shane still is out on the ocean, hunting for all kinds of, animals out there and in the woods. So he's really got that whole channel to, the ancient world, really. And And that's the amazing thing that, you know, survived, things that you wouldn't even think about have survived all these centuries. But that was talking about, you know, fighting for rights. And, you know, I was born in 1960. So during that time, I was just a baby watching, and, you know, 5 years old, watching all the civil rights and all the things that were being, you know, we call it Black Lives Matter now, but that was like, you know, Black Power, you know, and people fighting for their rights. And my older brothers and sisters, you know, some of them are 15 years older than me. And my sister was like living in Washington, D.C. at the time when there was like burning, you know, burning of the city, you know, after Dr. King was assassinated. So different things that have happened have an impact on us. You know, we're not like in a tiny little bubble on Shinnecock. We're all interconnected, have always been interconnected. But the fight that I was involved in, you know, coming of age, like, I guess like 1980, and being a woman's liber, really, and not understanding, having to grow up and go to tribe meetings, not having a voice. You're sitting there, you're interested in your history, you're interested and you're concerned about your community. You can't talk, you can't vote, you can't say anything. And if any woman could come to the meeting, you could sit there. But here, you know, outside of Shinnecock, you walk outside and go into the town of Southampton, you know, you can vote in the national election. So I was one of the people who really fought for the women's right to vote, the women's right to speak, the women's right to, you know, have voting rights and to serve as a tribal trustee. But that was a long, long, long fight. And I mean, even other women were against it. And they would say, the men represent us. That's their position. And they would say, you know, to me, if you have a, you know, if you have a brother, if you have, you know, your father, if you have an uncle or grandfather, you tell him what you want. So he can tell, you know, at the tribe meeting what your wishes are. So my thing was, my father's not from Shinnecock. So how's my father going to go and tell anybody anything? So what about, you know, people in my situation? And anyway, I can tell, you know, I can speak for myself. I have my own thoughts and, you know, feelings. And so anyway, that was, you know, part of that. It was just a small group of us. And just finally, after months and months and months of debate and, you know, other men, you know, standing up for us and say, you know, that's right. The women should have the right. And finally, it was like a shocking night. It was like exactly December 21st, 1993, when finally it was just the right combination of people. It was the right time. All these discussions had happened and it was voted. So that was an amazing night. And then actually I was sitting there, you know, in our church, because that's where we used to have our meetings. And this one woman who was opposed to me and, you know, and other people said, oh, now you have the right to talk, now speak, as she walked out of the church. But I didn't have to talk. I want to talk when I want to talk. I didn't have anything to say at that moment, except I was in shock. So, I mean, it's amazing that starting when, you know, Kwashawan was the one who was our, you know, our Sunk Squaw, our leader, having equal power and authority over our people, to finally, you know, hundreds of years. And it's just amazing to be living in this time where you actually experience that. You can talk, you can breathe, you can say what you think, you can learn your history and then be able to share it with others. And as a matter of fact, my niece, Nicole, thanks, she was the first one to be elected in the position, because now we have a seven member. It's called Council of Trustees. We transitioned to a broader representation of our people. And so she served for a couple of years. And then my daughter just got elected, and that's Kelly Dennis. and she was just elected in April as the next woman. So that's just an amazing thing. That's another shocking revelation. Like, wow, you got voted into office. So she's been very, very busy since then.
Clear, you've done a great job raising children, so all power
Yeah.
to you. That's fantastic. Shane said something that stuck with me. He said lines between communities through colonialism was a way to like overpower the people, and that brought me back to an article that I read with Shanae, and she talked about unifying the Indigenous people because more power together to conquer the overall issues that hurt the Indigenous community. So I'd love to hear from Shanae on her work and what she does as far as building the community and bridging them together, her role as an activist, and just some of the work, amazing work that she's been doing with sustainability and economic development on the nation, as well as her business and whatever she feels the need to broadcast.
Thank you. I really appreciate Shane starting off with the very beginning, that whole very big bang, starting off from the creation story, and also having Denise in here, who's from our parents' generation. So we're able to really bring it from the very start to right now. And so I just was listening, and I just was thinking, like, it just, and I like how, it just flowed. And I was just thinking, like, wow, because history repeats itself. We say that so much, right? One of the things that I've been saying a lot, especially these last 2 years, but really during the pandemic, because social media has been a big, huge benefit to Indian countries, specifically during the pandemic, because everybody finally was paying attention. And we were already on I've heard my auntie say, sacred Facebook. We've already been on sacred social media for a long time. That's how when our relatives put the call out for the pipeline in the Dakota Access Pipeline, they posted videos of women, right, going back to women, standing up with their children and then being attacked by dogs. It's somewhat, and it's not really just a Shinnecock story. Like I said, I lived all around the world. I lived in Saudi Arabia, Kamish Mashay. I was at the age where I didn't have to be fully covered. So I was able to go in the houses of the Muslim people and Islam people and see the difference between where their men sleep and eat and host family, and then where the women do. My dad had a great job of networking with people. I guess I get a little bit of that from him. But we were able to go into the house of a lot of princes of Kamish Mashay and to see the difference in even just how their wives are treated. But I think for me, that came full circle during the Women's March of 2017, after when I came back from Standing Rock in 2016. And the Women's March, there were marches that were happening around the world. And there was a march in, I believe, maybe Saudi Arabia or somewhere close to Saudi Arabia, with women standing up for their rights. And so here you're talking about our ancestor, Kwashawam, her grandmother, Kwashawam, her aunt, Kwashawam. You also have Weedamo. You have a lot of women that were not spoken of, Quayapen, the Mampam. You have a lot of women that were not spoken of here in the Northeast, but they really stood beside sometimes our warriors in battle. And you see that today. You see that this women's movement, you see it in so many different ways. And I guess in some of the work that I do, I guess being female, right, it's just kind of by default. So if I speak up, sometimes I'm going against, colonial tradition just by doing so. And I'm just speaking up because I'm a woman. But I guess that also brings me back to the creation story and to today, because the origin of importance, and Shane said it, you know, we are a matriarchal society, right? So the women are, they make the decisions because we're life givers and we're life bearers and we're life nurturers and we sustain life. So we have a big say on what happens in life. We birth the children, we birth the nation essentially. But what's happened from the creation story up till now is there's been this huge epidemic of missing, murdered, and Indigenous women. So when you take the women's voice away, when you take their lives away, and when you abuse them, you weaken the nation, you weaken the culture, you have access to the land. So the same things that we're seeing with some of these pipelines that are being built, you know, there's a lot of insidious and historical trauma within that. The Dakota Access Pipeline, Dakota being a people and having access to the land, and you know, in a term, I don't know who's in my audience, so I'm going to be careful in the intergenerational language that I use here. Plus, my godson sitting here. You know, but there's access to the land in a colonialized way. On our side, there's a pipeline called the Algonquin Pipeline. You know, there's not a coincidence of that. You know, and it's going through the areas, and just what Shane was talking about our people extending all the way down into like New Jersey and even into the Carolinas and up into Canada. We called ourselves Anishinaabe people, the people of the Dawnlands, the Ninamasinawa people. And that's where that Algonquin pipeline is going through. But at the same time, these are also the places where the women were, their voice was taken away. And this became a learned behavior. Unfortunately, we heard it through Denise and her experience and speaking up and making change within our nation. So I think one thing that I focus on now is really just trying to empower our young women and young men, because the lateral violence and the abuse between us is what's really going to continue the perpetuation of a genocide of a woman. And I say woman because it's the woman that has to go. And we are essentially matriarchal, you know, although on paper, because we use that term land, we use that term trustee, but anybody in here that understands trusts and all those kind of things, trusts are the land trustees. So in order for us to be able to do what we needed to do, we had to put men in place. But some of the men will still tell you that they listened to what their grandmothers were saying before they would go into the meetings. They would listen to sometimes what their uncles, what their sisters or their wives would say sometimes, because that's who they'd have to go home to. So I think for me, when it comes to Shinnecock, just exactly what Shane said, our great, powerful creation story. One thing that I've been saying is that if something happens to the Shinnecock people, then what happens to the Stony Shores? Because we all have to essentially live on this planet at the end of the day. Black, brown, Chinese, woman, man, non-binary, you know, whatever it is that people identify themselves with, or whether they don't know who they are and they just want to connect. We all have to live on this earth. We all have to drink clean water. But if Shinnecock people were placed here, a part of our creation story, and we still reside in these areas, and if something happens to us, then something happens to that Stony Shore. And if something happens to that Stony Shore, then what happens to that part of the world? And if something happens to that part of the world, then it's a ripple effect. So there's a big responsibility that we have as Shinnecock people. And I'm just really proud to say that I am Shinnecock, but to be able to travel, be gifted that opportunity from birth to be able to travel all around the world and see that from this perspective, but help connect people to one another.
Thank you, Shanae. I'm sure somebody, you have an intersecting identity. So, I mean, those are a lot of parallels, the things that you were speaking, powerful connections to, you know, the African-American community. And I can completely understand the need and inspiration for you, you know, promoting women. And you're definitely on the right track and continue to do that. And where did we want to go to next? You can click the next slide, Terry. So I would love to get Shane to speak on the Grave Protection Society. This is a series by Jeremy Dennis called Sacredness of the Hills. Also included in that series was the beginning slide photo. And I would love to hear about the struggles you're facing with tribal sovereignty and just the land being taken over and preserving the land and prevention of grave desecration. Whoever would like to comment on that, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. So as I mentioned, I'm co-chair of the Shinnecock Nation Graves Protection Warrior Society. And that was kind of the way I became co-chair of that society was the torch was kind of passed to me by elders who had been in this fight of protecting our ancestral burial grounds for their entire lives and their generations before them. The purpose of our society is to protect ancient and current burials from being desecrated by private homeowners, companies, any kind of desecration. And the reason we have to do that is because there has not been a law, a state law, put in place that penalizes anybody, any private landowner, from reporting graves that are uncovered on their property, and that they can do with whatever they want with our ancestors or whoever they may dig up. And for our people, we know where our burial grounds are all over the island. We've always known. We've always known that. We've known the sacredness of certain areas, as was said earlier. And I think the disregard for our existence, our 13,000 years of existence here, played a huge part in the trauma that has overcome our people over the generations. And it was very systematic the way colonization did that. And it started off, like I said, for us with the Great Awakening in the early 1700s, trying to disconnect our people from our culture, from our spirit, our connection to the land. All three of us have talked a lot about the land here. And we've always known the earth to be our mother. And in our language, Aki comes from Okas, mother, our word for mother. We are literally acknowledging the earth as our mother when we say that. And so because during the Great Awakening, all of that happened. A lot of our cultures and teachings had to go underground. And then in the mid 1800s started the residential schools, which was the Great Awakening really institutionalized in America and Canada, or United States, I should say, and Canada. And what they would do, the Canadian and United States government, was take Native children, take Indigenous children from their families and force them into these residential schools, usually far away from their homelands. And they would treat them horribly. They would treat them, they would serve them horrible food. They would beat them, or worse, if they spoke their language, said anything about ceremony, about our cultures. And the after effects of that is starting to come to light with I believe it's still 1,505 children's bodies that they found in 7 residential schools throughout North America, of the nearly 500 that were in play between the mid 1800s. And the last one didn't close down in Canada until 1996. In the 1990s, they were still taking Native children from their families and forcing them into these schools. And I know a lot of people that went through that. A lot of my friends and colleagues went to those schools, and people on Shinnecock. A lot of them are elders now. A lot of them have passed on, but in my lifetime, there were people that from Shinnecock that remember going to those schools and the atrocities that took place there. And so, for us, these burial grounds that we have, particularly the Shinnecock Hills, which is just right near our reservation right now. We focus there because we know Shinnecock Hills to be stolen, right? And we know a lot of places to be stolen, but it's not proof. You can't prove it on paper, right? Because maybe we didn't have an understanding of the law at the time, or we didn't speak English, or something like that. But they wrote it on paper, and so therefore it's law. But with the Shinnecock Hills, if you've seen the movie Conscience Point, the film Conscience Point, it details exactly how the Shinnecock Hills were stolen. And basically, what the court said was that yes, the hills are stolen, but because we took too long and they claimed latches, that there's nothing they can do about it in today's world because they can't disrupt the expectations of the current homeowners. And so, but the Shinnecock Hills for us are our burial grounds. We know that to be our burial grounds, all the way from the graves that have been uncovered there are several thousand years old, all the way till right before we were forced onto this little Shinnecock neck that we're on now, when the railroad came through in 1859. And so our purpose as Shinnecock Graves Protection Warrior Society is to stand up for those lands, stand up for our ancestors that are buried there, and try and preserve as much open land as possible, try and prevent digging going on, because it's inevitable that our ancestors are going to be buried, uncovered rather, unburied. And just in 2019, we've had ancestors uncovered. Just recently, though, because of that, we've been able to have Southampton Town pass legislation that would require testing in that zone before any development. So that way we can at least try and prevent a burial uncovering. Also, a law that penalizes private homeowners from not reporting bodies dug up out there. And as I was saying, the 1,505 children, they were in unmarked graves. They were not known to be there. They were hidden because of how they were murdered at those schools, and they would consider these graves here in the Shinnecock Hills unmarked as well. But just as our people did not forget those children at the those residential schools, maybe 100, maybe 50 years ago, maybe 200 years ago, we don't forget our ancestors in those hills, whether it be 100, 200, 2,000 years ago. We know that they're there, and we have an obligation, we have an inherent responsibility to protect them. And so that's our cause and our mission as Graves Protection goes. Does anybody else want to comment on that?
I just wanted to add, thank you, Shane, for that. It was so inspired. If you go to have a chance to order Conscience Point online, to see what Becky, our cousin, has gone through so many supervisors and so many different lawyers in the town of Southampton, and so many passing of the bucks, and we'll have our lawyers look at this, and not being held accountable, and just really feeling like as a people, you're just like on the outside looking in. You're just constantly not taken seriously or anything like that. But with that 2018 grave that came up on Hawthorne Road in the Shinnecock Hills. Now, as a little child, I just can't even remember when my mother's, every single time we passed that area in Shinnecock Hills, where it's like the highest point, and that's like another indication. These are where our people are. My mom would say, that's where our people are. And my mom couldn't even drive. You know, she never really learned how to drive a car, but every single time as my father drove alone, she just let us know that, you know, it's like we don't have the written language, but we have the historical, you know, we tell our stories to each other and then we pass it down. Then I started saying the same thing to my kids. That's where, you know, the little kids, that's where our people are. And I don't know, to make people like understand, it would be like, you know, going to Arlington with all the, you know, the markers, the stones, and just being so humble of that sacredness and that love of people who sacrificed. That's the feeling, I mean, still I have, especially after actually seeing, you know, one of our people being disturbed, you know, eyewitness. And really that came about because, you know, there is no protection in the state of New York. As Shane is saying, we're one of the states in all of the United States that does not protect these unmarked graves when they belong. Now they're in the hands of a, you know, a homeowner now. But, you know, I blame that, you know, the town of Southampton for not even telling these people who are buying this land, you know, buyer beware. You might start digging up someone. And it just so happened with this particular case that the people who were working on Hawthorne Road, who had purchased the land and were builders, had already been in, had helped Becky with some other projects that she was doing. So they were friends of our nation. We have many friends and allies anyway through the years. They called her first when they found these bones with a bulldozer. And the only reason why they even found the bones, because it was a horrible downpour that day. And that was because there was a bottle. And it was this old bottle, they're called onion bottles, and they're from colonial times. And so when Becky had called me, you know, because like I say, we communicate with each other, we're all cousins, aunts, uncles. And I had just really gotten involved with her, you know, with the Graves Protection Warrior Society. And I had wanted to be a part of it earlier, but, you know, you can't always be there until you're, you know, able to be there and commit to all of this, because it is a serious commitment. Pouring down rain, her friends had called her who were working on this property. I drive there. Jeremy was with me. And there was one detective there and they wouldn't let us, they had roped off the area. They wouldn't let us go and look any further. And he said, well, I don't think it's that old because there's a glass bottle down there. Because Jeremy has been doing all this research that's online and he had his phone with him on the site, or Jeremy native, he said, is this what the glass bottle looked like? That man almost fainted. He said, yes, that's what it looks like. And come to find out, that same almost exact type bottle was found in burial grounds in Montauk. And Jeremy had it documented. Other detectives started pouring into the site, Southampton Town Police. They said, that's probably, you know, a murder scene. Now this grave was, you know, there was roots intertwined with it. So whatever kind of, you know, MS-13 that they actually said is that it could be an MS-13 site. So you're not permitted to go any closer. We're saying these are our relatives. You're disturbing our people. I actually said to them in a somehow calm voice, how would it feel like if your grandfather was dug up, or your great-grandfather, or your great-great-grandfather? You know, it was traumatizing. We witnessed them raking the scene. Why are you raking the scene and disturbing it? And you could tell that there was charcoal in there. But again, it's all about education, not communicating. You know, these men, they had no idea about any Shinnecock sacred lands. That's not part of their police training. Their training is for, you know, what's here and what's now, not people who have been here thousands and thousands of years. So, and then the whole thing with that, when that ancestor showed up at 2018, just before that, that's when the US Open occurred, the last US Open at Shinnecock Hills. And Nicole, you know, she was a trustee at the time, my niece that I had mentioned, who was the first woman trustee, and Kelly had banded together to find a place at Southampton Stony Brook, so that we could talk about how the whole Shinnecock Hills Golf Course is a whole entire cemetery. That's all, you know, historical. It's all, you know, written down. So they gave us a little tiny area in the corner of where Southampton Stony Brook is, along with the police, the Southampton Town Police Chief. They made arrangements so we could have a freedom of speech area, so we could talk about, you know, these players. You know, a lot of us love golf. It's not against the golfers, you know, we're fans of them. It's just that, are you aware that you're walking on what would be equivalent to Arlington National Cemetery to play golf? So they allowed us to have a freedom of speech area in this tiny, tiny little area. And this was at the same time people were out there, like Shanae and the pipeline, almost around all that same time. We were watching images, and Shanae was sharing, and other people who had gone with her, those images of them out there with the dogs. One day they had one of those dogs, a similar type dog, where we're trying to do our peaceful freedom of speech. Why would they have an attack dog where it's the United States Open? They only let us speak at like 6 o'clock in the morning. There's nobody around at 6 o'clock in the morning to hear us. The lines along Montauk Highway with all the, you know, traffic, people are still trying to get to work, to school, with the US Open, tangling up. It was insane. So that's why that sign that was used for that US Open, when will we get our Shinnecock Hills back? So we put it along the fence where we were standing. Each day that we did our peaceful presentation, demonstration, they had another thing that they did. It was like, what are they going to do today? Well, the sound system doesn't work today. And then the next time they had this two long flatbed trucks lined up. So the people who were on Montauk Highway, stuck in traffic, couldn't see us. So there will always some type of tactic. You can have your freedom of speech, but we're going to make sure that nobody ever hears you. The problem is there's social media, and that information went out through social media. And then it was shortly after, that's when the ancestor was found in Shinnecock Hills to affirm, because we were doing all kinds of, you know, our prayers. We were speaking of our ancestors. We had our allies getting up, you know, they came 6 o'clock in the morning to walk down. And that was the other thing. They wouldn't even let us park there. They said, oh no, you can't park here. This is for the US Open. All that parking lot at Southampton, Stony Brook, where nobody was there at 6 o'clock in the morning. They made us drop people off, and then park back at our Shinnecock Museum parking lot. Is there anything to stop our voices?
Wow. Honestly, I had to stop myself from tearing up half of that. It's unfortunate and very sad, and I can only imagine the feeling of your people going through that. And I'm very thankful that we have people like you that are speaking out and able to speak for your ancestors, because you are their voices, and that shows today. And hopefully this presentation, if not just showing that these issues are present and they're still prevalent, hopefully we can help bring some resolution, if not exposure. I'd love to get through some of these slides a little bit faster because we are running out of time. So we can go to the next slide, or the following slide. Shane mentioned Conscious Point earlier as one of the first location that English colonialists, I probably butchered that, made contact with the Shinnecock people. There also is a film. If we go to the next slide, I'd love to play the trailer. This is a great way to educate yourselves. I think that the film is, moving, and it's also a woman directed film, and I'd love to show this trailer. Oh, do you have to log into YouTube? I don't think it's a YouTube link, so you should just be able to click on it and it'll play.
But Terry, I'm sorry. For some reason, I cannot get it to play. So I'm going to be, I'll put it in, I'll try to get the link into the chat so people can watch it that way. On Google, YouTube's won't play on my Google. This is my fault, and I apologize.
Oh, no worries, absolutely. So that link, once again, will be available at the end as well. But I think that's a very good place to start, especially when we're talking about the relations with the Shinnecock people and the overall expansion of the Hamptons image and the way that things are going. Not just for, we see that the changes as, just being Long Islanders, and we want to preserve our way of life, but I don't think we really see it as there are natives here that are trying to preserve their heritage and their culture and their land, who are fighting directly with, rich and powerful people, and preserving their, weekend trips and their way of life and their, summer vacation. So I think this is a beautiful film, and a great talking point, and makes you really sit back and think on what you can do. We can push to the next slide if possible. I would love to talk about Ma's legacy. I don't think we've gotten to talk about Ma, and also the restoration of a museum being made out of Ma's home. And that's directly connected with Jeremy Dennis. Not only is he a fine arts photographer, but he is creating an amazing project that I think everybody will be interested in supporting. So I'd love for Denise to tell us about her mother.
Okay, certainly. She would be very pleased because my mother was a glamour girl, and she was always having us taking photographs of her. She said, take me a picture here, take me, they say World War II brides with the red lipstick and the whole thing. So that's my mom, and that photograph was actually taken on site at Ma's house. That's where I grew up. That's where our family grew up. That's where my mom was allocated her 3 acres when she applied to have my dad build a house there. Now, as I said before, we were a big family, and some of the kids were already getting ready to go into college. So, it was like, oh, everybody had all these different needs. So it was very, very difficult to come up with that idea of building on Shinnecock at that time. You don't get a mortgage. You do not qualify for a mortgage on Shinnecock because the land is owned by everyone. And if you default on the mortgage at any bank, they cannot take the house from you. So no one will help you. So that's a whole one of those systems that were set up once our land was taken. It was so difficult to actually live on what land was left, because how are you going to live? And kind of, I think what happened with us, we survived it because we are used to being a family. So different from a nuclear family, a family where the grandma's there, the granddad's there, the aunts, the nieces, cousins. We're still like that. You know, we still all live together, not living off of each other, but helping each other to live and to survive. That was our survival, but it's a traditional mechanism where we all help each other and look out for each other. So anyway, with my mom's house, that I guess it was like in the late 50s when she was given her allotment by our 3 tribal trustees, and they have to approve. You have to, you know, go and talk to them and say, this is where, you know, I want my husband, Peter Silva, to build. So he didn't have any money to build a house, but he was a very skilled carpenter, self-taught carpenter. And he was a captain in the United States Army during World War II. And he had gotten all this kind of different training to help him. My mom always said, your dad was like a genius. So what he did is he took apart a parsonage in Riverhead, in the next town over, and transported it on his truck. He was self-employed. He had his Peter Silva and Sons construction, and put all the windows and all the doors and every single piece of wood on his truck and started transporting these pieces over to Shinnecock. And then he dug a foundation, was his first thing. And then he had a full basement and laid every single brick around that full basement. And then all we could really do at the time was just to kind of build like a small square house that had like a basic living room, a basic kitchen, and a bathroom. That was it in the basement. So it was like, okay, all these bunk beds in there, a pull-out couch in there, a little side bedroom in there. And that's how I grew up, in Ma's house. That was the original Ma's house. And I believe even at the time, you know, since again, couldn't get a mortgage to get help, you know, it's hard to even have a bathroom installed or plumbing installed. So my dad built a little, it was kind of a big outhouse. One was men and women. And on one side was men, one side was women. And we used to have a pump out there, in that house there, not with the dome on top. It was just the first little square section. And I recently asked my eldest brother, I said, well, how was it living, if we were living in Riverhead at the time, how was it to live like in a regular neighborhood? It was like in Polish Town on Parkway Street in Riverhead, to go to Shinnecock. And he said, well, it was like an adventure and like Swiss Family Robinson. And, you know, because they transitioned from everybody had their own bedroom to, all right, you're all bunking in together. It was like a camp or something like that. And we loved it because it's so beautiful. And we had all these animals there. And then through the years, my dad would just build on another section. The only way he could do it is he would get a big contract. I think it was Revson was the name of the man from the Revson Cosmetics, had a house on the ocean, contracted my dad to build, you know, all of this construction on this mansion. And he had enough money to build a big extension on the back, not to finish it, but just to build. So later on, my brother David, who was a teacher and a builder, he would keep adding, but the house would never be done. It would just be, you know, we'll try to get some money together and then just do a little bit at a time. But now it had gone into disrepair. Fast forward now, disrepair. I was staying with my mom and my family. We were the last ones to stay with her before she passed. And as she got older, I said, Ma, you know, we're getting ready to move into our house we've been working on. What do you want to do with your house? And she said, make it into a museum. First of all, she said, I'm never going to die. And I'm like, Ma, everybody passes away. She said, no, I'm never going to pass away. But then I finally got her to say, make it into a museum and share with the people, the history. So the history of our family, the history of Shinnecock, so that it's preserved, because we didn't even have the museum on the reservation yet. So that's what she had suggested. And then shortly after that, she passed away. The house went into disrepair. A raccoon family had moved in the last few years. It was heartbreaking to see. A tree had fallen on the side of it, which Shane helped remove with Avery one day. I was like, oh my gosh. Then Jeremy, with this COVID, with a silver lining, he was out doing residencies all over the United States. He was on his 4th residency, and COVID struck. He had to get back home, locked down across the nation. All of his plans were thrown out the window as far as keeping going on these residencies. And he said, Mom, Dad, I'm going to ask the rest of the family, can I make Ma's house into a residency? And, with all the strife going on in the nation with BIPOC people, he was like, I want it to be a place where BIPOC people can come and feel safe to express themselves. So right now, tonight, Andrina Smith is down there. This is like the first actually inside of the house where she's expressing her stories now. So they've been working on it for a year. Jeremy's dad, Avery, and him, every single day, working on it. It was horrendous, horrible. I pray for them. And because everything was rotten, the tub was getting ready to crash through to the basement, the kitchen sink floors, the termites, because the wood that was used was already hundreds of years old. So it's amazing. It's like prayers. I hope people that can go and visit to see the evolution of Ma's house. But I know that my mom is so happy and proud to see that it's finally, almost still working on it, but it's come as far as it has. And that's with allies. That's with people, knowing that, we're struggling and they want to help. So we've had so many allies. He did a GoFundMe and he just was able to, tell the story. And there's so many people who want to help. It's amazing. And all across the country, local people as well, libraries, all kinds of places.
Thank you, Denise.
You're
We will
welcome.
talk a little bit more about Ma's house before we go. In the meantime, Shanae is on a time constraint, so we want to hear her voice a little bit more. If we could go on to the next slide. And yeah, we'd like to talk about, preservation a little bit, and economic development more recently with some of the projects that are going on the Shinnecock Indian Nation. Shanae, pretty much just whatever thoughts you'd like to wrap up with, you could rapid fire. We just want to hear your voice before you have to go.
I'm so sorry, y'all. I guess I had thought that we'd be cutting it at 8. So my apologies to all the participants. I've been traveling since 6 a.m. with a 6-year-old, his first time on an airplane. So he has been sitting patiently waiting for half an hour right now. You're doing such a great job. Yeah, I guess economic, you want me to talk about, this is Denise's beautiful painting of our community center there.
I think it's the next slide, I think, is your slide, Shanae. Oh yeah, that's it.
Okay, yes. Yeah, so I am an entrepreneur, just kind of born and raised as an entrepreneur with both parents. My mother is a beautiful artisan. She met my dad at FIT, which is the Fashion Institute of Technology. And one of her biggest passions was to create native textiles, and so like now when you go into like Urban Outfitters and all these different kind of places and you find native inspired, she wanted to create native created things. And so growing up with my dad being from Philly, getting his first job at like the age of 8, kind of thing. I kind of grew up in that kind of household. And then understand the importance of group economics in all of the different communities that we've lived in. And I have to say, this generation, which is my generation, and even the ones younger than me, there is a booming amount of young people that are entrepreneurs on Shinnecock. I mean, right here, you just saw Jeremy and his endeavors with Ma's house and the money that he was be able to raise to put into not only his family's legacy, but to continue the legacy of what people are doing here. So myself, I actually own a consulting firm. The consulting firm is called Mosquito Consulting. It kind of spawned out of my frustration as a young person of color, woman, Black, Native American, working in museums. And I realized that they didn't hire Indigenous companies, nor did they hire people of color a lot of times as quote unquote experts on who we are. And oftentimes we were quite underpaid and undervalued. And I just felt extremely frustrated. And I was told that, oh, you have to have your PhD, or oh, you need to have this to be able to climb the ladder. And I said, no, you don't. There's a lot of people that I know that didn't go to school and they're entrepreneurs. So I stepped out and decided to create my own business, doing exactly what I do, being able to, be an activist, being able to be a bridge, being able to create mediation between tribal governments and governments. I've been able to work in corporate America to kind of get an understanding on how to run large international enterprises. And that just wasn't the greatest fit, but I felt like I was kind of in there like the Trojan horse to just really get an understanding on like how to really manage that level of business and bring it back to my community and inspire people to do the same. So that's kind of what spawned Mosquito Consulting. So when I got the text message from Becky Genia about that they were digging in our hills last year, actually December 28th of 2000, look, pandemic happened, 2019. And she said they were digging in our hills. And so I think it was January 5th. I was working at Porsche Cars North America as an e-commerce marketing manager at the headquarters in Atlanta. And I told them I was no longer coming in. I founded Mosquito Consulting in 2019. And so now that's what I do full time. I stepped out on complete faith and I put a prayer out there and I stood with our ancestors on January 5th and, just said, okay, I'm going to do this. And so all of these different things that you see right here, I guess, is pretty much what's really sustaining me, but it's also kind of bringing everything together here. So during the pandemic, I also noticed that there was a lot of need for people to understand medicinal plants. And my brother actually inspired me because he's a tech guy into all this different kind of tech. And he's like, you're always doing these pop-up villages and going into museums and you just have all this historical knowledge and it's just amazing. He said, but Shanae, it's a pandemic. People need to access that by a click of a button. And I was challenged. I was like, oh, okay. So how do I put all that in like a digital format? Like what I videotape? And so it was January of this year and I sat on my couch and I was like, you know what? I have been gifting these mosquito boxes, mosquito meaning medicine, these medicine boxes during the pandemic to different people that I know throughout the country with different herbs in them, like burdock root, bear root, dandelion, mullein, elderberries, echinacea, the different things that I had harvested last year. And I put in there little pamphlets of the medicines. So I said, you know what? Well, he challenged me. I sat in my house and I said, you know what? Well, maybe I'll just talk about 50 of them. So I just, on an Excel spreadsheet, just wrote 50 plants that I have off the top of my head that are, traditional to our homelands, specifically here in the Northeast. and just kind of really started talking about them, you know, and I really wanted it to be a guide, if you will, for people that were finally going outside and taking to the parks and caring about the environment. So that kind of spawned the 50 Plant Medicines, Indigenous Oral History and Perspective. So it's currently an ebook. And then from that, you know, I got the phone call from the Brooklyn Botanic Garden the day of my book launch, February 10th of this year. And they asked me to curate an audio tour. So that's what we did there. So if you were to go to Brooklyn Botanic Garden, there's a really awesome audio tour. I haven't been there yet. Hopefully I get to go take my godson next week. But it's really awesome. And, you know, my hope was really to bridge more Indigenous people into those types of institutions, specifically them. They have hopes to do a lot more beyond just this, but it's kind of the first of its kind, specifically after last year with Black Lives Matter, a lot of people being checked for their diversity and lack of inclusion. And so, you know, people are wanting to make things right. So that's kind of that. And then tomorrow is the Indigenous Perspective Canoe Tour that will be at Conscious Point. This is probably our fourth one, and we'll be doing it in the next couple of months. So really, Mosquito Consulting is just, you know, something that, you know, for a long time, being an activist and working in corporate America and dealing with lateral violence, sometimes within my own community or just some of the nonprofits, I needed to fulfill my purpose and what Creator put me here to do. And I don't, you know, so I just said, all right, this is what I'm going to do. And the real goal is to create jobs for people to do the same, to sustain themselves. I know this is something that a long time ago, Shane and I used to talk about. And, you know, I remember when I first started and I was like, yo, I started Mosquito Consulting, you know, and so now it's just kind of taken off. So hopefully next year I'll be able to have some employees, you know, because that gets back to the group economics. It's important. You know, I do wear another hat here for my tribe, and this is something that's kind of in progress. But I am the managing director for our nation's cannabis business. You know, and I stepped into that role. I was offered that role at the end of 2019. And I'm not fully in it because our tribe is still working on a lot of, you know, things on the legal side as far as our laws are concerned, because there is a separate jurisdiction between the Shinnecock territory and the New York territory and the United States. So we govern our own selves. So once those things are in place, I will be able to fully step into my position as the managing director of our tribe's cannabis business. But my real hopes is to really protect the sacred plant. There's been a lot of exploitation of medicinal plants, cannabis and hemp being one, as well as sage and sweetgrass and cedar and things that you can now buy in Whole Foods. And I call it the prostitution of plants, unfortunately. You know, Mother Earth has a spirit, these plants have a spirit, and they have a connection to us and we have a value to them. So I believe that my real role in that is to really protect that sacred medicine, and to help my people understand the sacredness in it and to not abuse it. And also to not be left out of an industry where people call it something that people once used, or Indigenous people have always used this. And here we are as Indigenous people kind of off to the side. So that's kind of where my role is now in that, and to one, create jobs and opportunities, but real business to business, you know, successful businesses really outsource. And instead of outsourcing outside of our community, you know, you have a consulting firm, you might have other wellness lines and products that can be purchased. So that's kind of the, you know, the vision with being able to help my community understand and enroll in group economics so that we can fully be self-sufficient. So I guess that's my rapid fire there.
So much, Shanae, and thank you to all of the panelists. We're kind of going to just rush through the last few slides of here because I do want to shout out the events that are upcoming, as well as wrap up with some tips and closing remarks as to where do we go from here to our audience members. So the Gather events have started officially today. That is why Jeremy couldn't make it, but we are happy that he's continuing the conversation. The next few events, you can go to the next slide. So today they had a Left Behind Within. They had stories and poetry by Adrena Smith. I don't want to pronounce her middle name wrong. The 17th, like Shanae mentioned, there's going to be the paddle tour. And then the 18th, they're going to be doing a book talk on whaling. And once again, these links, I believe, will be available. If anybody has trouble and wants to learn more, just reach out, I'm sure, to the Shelter Island Library, or even contact me personally. I'd be happy to provide you with the information. And the last one is history, crafting, and practice. I do want to just wrap up with what allyship means. Obviously, I could read the slide, but I think that it bottles down to simply listening. There's lots more to learn than we think there is. And we need to learn more than what we were taught in school, because as most of us know, those aren't the most accurate depictions of history, and those accounts typically go to quote unquote winners of history. We must continue to celebrate the triumphs of Native Americans. The Shinnecock do an amazing job of allowing people to not only communicate with them and educating people, but also inviting them to their annual powwow and extending their arms into, you know, the outward community. I do believe that the powwow this year was canceled due to the COVID pandemic, but I am hoping that they have some virtual event. If not, there's always next year. They are always here. They will always be here. Supporting your fellow neighbors and also artists and activists like those that were featured today. Once again, we do have links to all of their websites, ways you can support them. I know that Denise is an artist herself, and she also does beautiful jean jacket art, so I might be purchasing some of that from you soon. I have a blank jacket waiting. Celebrate their culture, but not appropriate it. That's one of the most important things, especially on Shelter Island. I know we just came out of the talks about our mascot, and that was something I spoke on at the meeting, and it was received very well, and we are in the works of changing that. And I think that's a great step for our community to show that we are standing in solidarity with the Shinnecock Nation by first removing that and taking steps toward educating. Shelter Island has a very unique history, especially talking with Sylvester Manor. I know we've mentioned Dawn Marie. She's been on the panel for one of our previous conversations. So I just want to keep the conversation going. It doesn't end here. If you have any questions or anything, just shoot them to the Shelter Island Library. I'm sure Terry would be happy to receive those. If not, I will also put my email in here. I'm very humbled and grateful to our panelists for being here. Your words and your wisdom, everything, your emotion, I felt it tonight, and I'm really happy that you guys had me. If you have any last words, I'd very much be happy to hear them.
I just want to say just thank you for listening. Thank you for letting us have a voice. You know, it's so important to just share and just the respect for each other, and just sit down and have a conversation. It's so much medicine, you know, it's such a good thing to do. So it's really great. Thank you so much.
I really appreciate it. Tell Jeremy we missed him. And
I know, I miss him too.
I would love to get over there and attend one of the events, but if not, I hope to visit. Maybe we could all link up.
Yeah,
so I really
nice.
appreciate it.
Okay.
Shane, anything?
Yes, thank you all for having us. And we'll just close by saying Wame Natapel, which in our language just means all of my relations. And it's an acknowledgement of our interrelationship, our interconnection with all of creation and everybody and everything. So thank you.
Thank you very much. That's what Necessary Bridges is about. We really appreciate your presence, Shane. Thank you.
I want to thank everyone for being here. Thanks to Terry for being a great moderator. I'm going to be having the YouTube video up on our YouTube channel, SI Library, and I'll also put it on Facebook and put a link in our Instagram tomorrow. But you can also email me, tlucas@silibrary.org, any questions. I hope this is not our last conversation. I feel like there was so much more to say. So I hope that we can do this again sometime. And again, thank you. I know we've taken a lot of your time and we really appreciate it. And it's been a wonderful evening. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Thank you. Nice working with you all.
Thank you all so much for coming. Really appreciate it.